Our subject today is the political horizon of the two major ethical positions that we have been discussing. And I want to begin by reminding you of an idea that we have presented. The maximalist version of the ethic of connection and the corrected version of the ethic of self-fashioning come closer together. In coming closer together, they continue to be separated from each other by profound and recalcitrant differences. In some way, their approach to each other, once both of them are revised, brings out all the more clearly the fundamental differences between them. It is, however, not surprising that the corrected version of the ethic of self-fashioning and the maximalist version of the ethic of connection should have a large area of political overlap in their political programmatic implications. And what we want to do in today's class is to suggest a conception of the content of this overlap, of, as it were, the political program that is common to the revised version of each of the two ethics. Remember that the uncorrected version, the canonical version of the ethic of self-fashioning, seems to have no satisfactory political program. In the hands of the philosophers, of its philosophers, Nietzsche, Emerson, its political program seems to be the program of a kind of elitism. That is, there is an elite of disruptors, of rebels, contrasted explicitly or implicitly to the herd, to the majority of conformist humanity. And in addition to bearing the taint of this elitism, that position has no developed conception of how either the economy or the state or civil society, for that matter, should be organized. On the other hand, the minimalist version of the ethic of connection has an ambivalent position to the established organization of society. And the question that immediately arises is to what extent its humanizing objectives must take the established institutional arrangements as given. And together with this ambivalence or acceptance of the social template comes the question of the recognition of the contradictory character of our conditions of self-assertion. So the programmatic position that I am about to outline attempts to remedy this defect, this double defect, in the uncorrected versions of the ethic of self-fashioning and of connection, and to imagine, to project what this common political position of the corrected versions of each might look like. Now, to that end, I divide my comments into two large steps. In the first step, a conception of the method and of the goal of this political position that I'm about to outline. And then in the second step, a sketch of its institutional content. Its institutional content with respect to the economy, politics, civil society, and the empowerment and education of the individual. Now, first then, the broad conceptual space in which this alternative, which I'm claiming might be largely common to the two positions, would move. Let me begin with a characterization of our present conception of the ideological debate. That is a conception that the heart, the fulcrum of the ideological contest in politics is a conflict between what you could call shallow freedom and shallow equality. In this conventional view of the ideological controversy, the right are those who accord priority to freedom against the background of the established institutional arrangements, especially the established institutional arrangements of the economy and of politics. And the right are those who, against the same background, accord priority to equality. Shallowness, the shallowness to which I refer in the use of this nomenclature, is precisely that, the acceptance of the background institutional presuppositions. So you can see, for example, how this shallowness influences the content of the most influential ideas. Not just the influential ideas of the political parties and movements, but the influential ideas in political philosophy. For example, the theories of distributive justice that now exercise a paramount influence in the Anglo-American world, like the Rawlsian theory of justice, combine a profession of egalitarian faith with an institutional conservatism or skepticism. When you add these two elements up, the egalitarian faith and the institutional conservatism or skepticism, the sum of those two elements is then the justification of corrective redistribution by tax and transfer, by progressive taxation and redistributive social entitlements. And thus it seems that the pragmatic residue of this sum is the reduction of this egalitarian political philosophy to the justification of the homely context-bound practices of corrective and retrospective redistribution under institutionally conservative social democracy or social liberalism. The abstraction, the radicalism of the egalitarian idea turns out to be a feint and an illusion, because the practical consequence is simply this consequence of justifying principles that would establish a ground for after the fact corrective redistribution. And what is the problem with this retrospective and corrective redistribution? The problem is that after the fact, we can never fundamentally alter the consequences of the established structure for inequality. It will be an uphill struggle. We will be working against the logic of the established economic incentives and arrangements. And this tension, then, is captured in the familiar rhetorical apparatus of a contradiction between equity and efficiency. If, for example, the economy is organized in a way which establishes vast structural disparities between the advanced and the backward parts of production, the corrective redistribution would have to be massive in order adequately to deal with the consequences of this structural chasm. And long before it reached the requisite dimension to annul the unequalizing consequences of the structural differences, it would begin to exact an unacceptable cost in the loss of economic output. And that is why this retrospective redistribution by tax and transfer can never replace a structural solution to the structural problems. At best, it can attenuate the inequalities. In fact, one could say that the main historical achievement of institutionally conservative social democracy in the European social democracies, for example, has been the maintenance of a high level of investment in people and in their capabilities, in their education, in their health, but without any fundamental alteration in the underlying economic structure. So this is the consequence of what I'm calling shallowness. Now, how then should one reconfigure or reinterpret the ideological context? One might say, instead of shallow equality, one would want deep equality. But what would that mean? What it would mean is that one would have a radical redistributive mechanism that would cancel out the inequalities generated by the market order. So let's say there's this hierarchical division between the advanced and backward sectors. Then we imagine a redistributive mechanism that makes it all go away. For the sake of a radical equality of outcome or of circumstance. Now I ask, does anyone really want this? Does anyone want a society which sacrifices its development, its variety, its diversity, its richness of possibility for the sake of this radical equality of outcome or circumstance? Like a mythical version of ancient Sparta or ancient Rome, in which everyone is poor but equally poor. And I think not. And the liberals and socialists of the early 19th century also did not think that this was the real aim. What was their aim? Their aim was not to achieve this radical equality of circumstance. Their aim, I want to say, was to defend a shared empowerment. That is, their central idea is that we should become bigger, and we should become bigger together. And the struggle against entrenched inequality was subsidiary to that larger goal. Entrenched or extreme inequality is unacceptable because it impedes our ascent together to a larger form of life. How should one then, in the light of these considerations, understand today what ought to be the division between the right and the left? Let me suggest that it would be based on two criteria. The first has to do with the practice or the method, and in particular with the attitude to the established institutional structure. One fundamental division between the right and the left, or between the conservatives and the progressives, should be that the left or the progressives are those who refuse to take the established institutional arrangements of the economy and of politics as the unsurpassable horizon of their political projects. They want to achieve our ideals and our interests even by transgressing the boundaries of these established arrangements and assumptions. And the conservatives, by contrast, are those who take the established arrangements for granted and seek to make the best of them, to humanize them, to spiritualize them, to attenuate their extreme inequalities. Now let me say immediately, one of the implications of this contrast is to say that almost all the leftists that exist today would, by this criterion, in fact have to be classified as conservatives, including, of course, the European Social Democrats. Now then the question is, what is the goal? What is the aim? And here is the second criterion for the division between the right and the left. The goal is that we ascend together to a larger form of life, with broader scope, with greater intensity, with more capability. That the ordinary man and woman, the mass of ordinary humanity, go up together. And the distinction between the right and the left is whether we think of this ascent as something that we can enjoy together or as something that is reserved to a special part of humanity, even to a special part that has special spiritual credentials, such as the elite, of the nonconformists, of the disruptors. So then we have a completely different conception of the division between the right and the left, between the progressives and the conservatives. And I say this because the program that I'm about to outline is animated by this view. It combines a willingness to transgress the limits of the established institutional arrangements with a commitment to make us bigger together. The conservatives or the right on this view, on the view that defines the aim as deep freedom rather than deep equality. The conservatives or the right are those who think that it is natural for human life to be small, except when there is some emergency, such as war and its sacrificial devotions, which tears us out of this long littleness of life, tears us out of the rut, and subjects us to the extremes of of effort and aspiration. The left, or the progressives on this view, are those who believe that it is not natural for human life to be small, that we can ascend, that we should ascend together. That's the spiritual distinction. And the methodological or practical distinction, it has to do with our willingness or our refusal to accept the established institutional framework as the limit, as the horizon of our political pursuits. Now, with regard to this second criterion, there is a problem that I signaled in an earlier class. The problem is how we should think of these structures. So under the view of structure that we have inherited, for example, from Marxist theory, the structure is an indivisible system. And one of the consequences of that idea is the binary view of politics. All politics, on that view, is either the reformist management of an indivisible regime or system, or it is the revolutionary substitution of one system for another. In the early 19th century, the liberals and the socialists all had their institutional fetish. Each faction propounded a dogma and said, here is the road to both freedom and prosperity. The same institutional arrangements would establish the basis for both our material development and our moral emancipation from entrenched social division and hierarchy. Establish these arrangements, the socialist economy, the state-led economy, or the market economy in its conventional form as it emerged in early modern Europe, and you will be both free and rich. Our problem is that we face a difficulty without historical precedent. Like those liberals and socialists, we have reason to recognize the primacy of structural alternatives over non-structural ones. But unlike them, we also have reason to resist entrusting our futures to dogmatic institutional blueprints, and thus the novel problem. How are we to affirm the primacy of structure and structural alternatives without succumbing to a structural dogmatism? And part of the answer seems to be that we must privilege those institutions and practices that facilitate their own revision and allow themselves to be corrected in the light of experience. We must be able to find the way along the way. And this is then the note of democratic experimentalism in the development of such alternatives. Now, with those abstract conceptions as background, I then come to the second part of my discussion, which is the outline of the institutional content of this view that I'm claiming might be common, might be an area of overlap in the political horizon of the two ethics that we have discussed. And I will do so around four, as it were, four axes. The first axis is the reshaping of the economy. And we can bring it under the slogan, under the label of democratizing the market. The premise is that a market order has no single natural and necessary form. There are three things we can do with the market. We can regulate it, we can attempt to attenuate its inequalities after the fact through retrospective redistribution by tax and transfer, or we can change it. We can change the legal arrangements, the institutional arrangements that define it, that constitute its institutional architecture. And this third thing is much more important than the other two things. So in that conception, there are three large ambitions in a progressive political economy today. And they have to do with the relation between the backward and the advanced parts of production, with the relation between labor and capital, and with the relation between finance and the real economy. Now let me say just a word about each in summary form. First of all, the relation between the backward and the forward parts of production. There is now a new productive vanguard. We call it the knowledge economy. It's not confined to advanced manufacture. It exists in every sector of production, in intellectually dense services, and even in precision or scientific agriculture. But in each sector of production, it appears only as a socially exclusive fringe, locking out the vast majority of workers and of firms. This insular character of the new productive vanguard has momentous consequences for both economic stagnation and economic inequality. First of all, for stagnation. You know, there's a discussion in the United States that goes under the label secular stagnation, attempting to make the slowdown in the rise of productivity appear to look natural, under the claim, for example, that the technological innovations of today are less transformative than the technological innovations of 100 years ago. It seems absurd. What could be more revolutionary in principle than artificial intelligence? The much more straightforward explanation of this economic slowdown is that how could there not be slowdown if we are denying the most advanced practice to the great majority of the workers and of the firms? And it has vast consequences for inequality. Structural inequality is anchored in the hierarchical segmentation of the production system. Its division between advanced and backward sectors. Unless we can overcome this division, unless we can diminish this chasm, no amount of compensatory redistribution will suffice. And thus comes the project of attempting to lift up the vast economic periphery within each economy of the world. To lift it up, we must satisfy a series of conditions. We must have, for example, a different kind of education. I'll speak about that later. But we must also initiate a series of institutional changes in the organization of the market. We must now do in spades what the Americans did in the first half of the 19th century when, for example, they revolutionized agriculture. They organized a family-scale agriculture with entrepreneurial characteristics on the basis of partnership between the government and the family farmer and cooperative competition among the family farmers. They were independent proprietors and entrepreneurs, but they pooled resources to achieve economies of scale. So we must again establish a form of strategic coordination between the government and the small and medium-sized businesses of the vast economic periphery, or the economic agents that have lost stable connections to firms, like machine repairmen or nurse practitioners. And we must lift up this periphery. The economic agents must be transformed into technologically equipped artisans, and the relatively backward businesses must be brought closer to the productive vanguard. And then we begin to tinker with the institutional arrangements of the market order and to transform the present market order into a different one. Now, what is the ideal limit of this transformation of the market order? Let me imagine it by a thought experiment far in the future. And let me state it in the form of a radical idea. Let us imagine that what Karl Marx called the means of production, instead of being confided to particular owners who have absolute property rights, absolute and perpetual property rights, are vested in, for example, independent public trusts. And these independent public trusts conduct a kind of roving capital auction. No one has the major means of production in society permanently. You borrow the means of production, the pools of liquid capital, or the apparatus of advanced technology, if you are able to assure the fund, the trust, of the highest rate of return. There's a rotating, a permanent capital auction. And this thought experiment exposes an ambiguity or a confusion in the abstract conception of a market. What is a market? Even at the most abstract level, a market has at least two dimensions. One dimension is absolute decentralization, the number of economic agents who are able to bargain on their own initiative and for their own account. The other dimension has to do with the absoluteness of the control that each of those agents enjoys over the resources at his disposal. Under the conventional idea of the market, these two dimensions are inseparable. But it's obvious that they're not inseparable, and that in fact they can be in contradiction with each other. Because one of the ways to increase the absolute amount of economic decentralization, so that more people have more access to more capital and more markets in more ways, is to relativize the absoluteness of the control, to create property rights that are temporary or conditional or fragmentary, rather than to make them absolute under the traditional idea of unified property. Now, the second great theme of a progressive political economy is the relation of labor to capital. And the immediate problem, as it were, the emergency, is that in the current economies, in all the major economies of the world, an increasing part of the labor force is relegated to insecure, so-called precarious employment, the precariat. What we think of as the normal form of the organization of work prevailed, in fact, only in a relatively brief period from the middle of the 19th century to the middle of the 20th. The assembly of a stable labor force in large productive units like factories under the aegis of large corporations. It was preceded by several centuries in which work was organized on the basis of decentralized contractual arrangements. This was the putting out system described by Karl Marx in the early chapters of Das Kapital. And now we find that a new putting out system is being organized in the world on a global scale. Work is divided up into parts. Piecework, it's subcontracted. The vanguard of the knowledge economy discovers a way to separate its process of production into two parts. The profitable and most creative part it keeps for itself. The routinized part it subcontracts to workers and firms in remote parts of the world. This is the new putting out system. And so we need a solution to this emergency problem. And the solution is to create a new regime of labor law alongside the traditional regime of collective bargaining, which now reaches only a tiny minority of the labor force. 11 to 13% in the United States is unionized, to deal with this new economic reality. We cannot allow the economic flexibility required by the new economic arrangements to redound to a radical economic insecurity. We must master this reality. Organizing and representing the precarious workers, and when we cannot organize or represent them, through direct legal intervention in the employment relation. For example, by instituting a principle of price neutrality, so that work rendered under conditions of precarious employment will be remunerated at a level comparable to the similar work given under conditions of stable employment. And in this way, we would separate the legitimate aim of flexibility from the illegitimate result of the cheapening of labor and radical economic insecurity. But if we look further ahead into the future, the horizon of our ideas about the relation between labor and capital includes a lot more, goes a lot further. So first, in the relation between the worker and the machine, the evolution of technology. The evolution of technology is not an independent dynamic. We determine, we shape the evolution of technology. And we have an interest in preferring an evolution of technology that enhances the skills of the worker to an evolution of technology that simply replaces the worker. In Adam Smith's pin factory or in Henry Ford's assembly line, the worker worked as if he were one of his machines, through repetitious movements that mimic the movements of the machine. But what is the machine? The machine is everything that we have learned how to repeat. We can express in an algorithm or a formula, and then we can embody the algorithm or a formula in the physical contraption, the machine. The point of the machine is to do for us what we have learned how to repeat, so that we can preserve our supreme resource, our time, for the not yet repeatable. And then the combination of the machine and the anti-machine, the human being, the worker, will be immensely more powerful than either of them alone. So this transformation of the relation between technology and work is one of the long-term aims of a progressive program for the transformation of the economy. The other has to do with the status of free work. For the liberals and socialists of the early 19th century, it seemed self-evident that economically dependent wage labor was a transitory and inferior form of free work, retaining many of the characteristics of serfdom and slavery. So, and this was the view not just of Karl Marx, but of John Stuart Mill, of Abraham Lincoln. You read, for example, Lincoln's address to the Wisconsin Agricultural Society several years before the Civil War. He says, "No free man would willingly accept to be a wage worker for another man if he could avoid it." This was the dominant view. And it was only at the end of the 19th century that the predominance of economically dependent wage work as the primary form of free labor was naturalized. The view was wage labor has to give way to the higher forms of free work. And what are these higher forms? They are self-employment and cooperation. The cooperation among self-employed proprietors, entrepreneurs, and workers. The problem which they, the liberals and socialists of the 19th century, were unable to resolve was the reconciliation of this idea of free work with the relentless imperative of economies of scale in a dynamic modern economy. To reconcile economies of scale with these other forms of work, self-employment and cooperation, we have to allow for innovations in the property regime. Leading up to that extreme form, which I described a moment ago in my thought experiment. Now there's a third element in a progressive political economy, and that has to do with the relation of finance to the real economy. Under the current arrangements in every market order in the world, the production system is largely self-financed on the basis of the retained and reinvested earnings of private firms. What then is the point of all of that money in the banks and the stock markets? Theoretically, it's to finance the productive agenda of society. In fact, the vast majority of financial activity has a merely oblique or episodic relation to the funding of production. And a situation evolves in which, under the pretext of serving the real economy, finance serves itself. So we have to ask, by what institutional arrangements could we tighten the relation of finance to the real economy? The best way to make finance less dangerous is to make it more useful. The production system is self-financed. 80, 90% of the funding of production comes from within the production system itself. Finance, which is indifferent to the real economy in good times, becomes destructive in bad times. And then the financial activity that we might regard as most important to society, which is the financing of the creation of new assets in new ways, the concern of venture capital, in fact occupies a minuscule portion of financial activity. So we would have to discourage those forms of financial activity that make no plausible contribution to the enhancement of productivity or the expansion of output, discourage or prohibit, and multiply channels between the dormant, delayed consumption, the saving of society, and productive investment. And ultimately going in the direction of the capital auction that I described before. Now, you can see all of that I've described. What is that? That's a transformation of the market. Is that socialism? It doesn't accord with these categories. It's the idea that the market is subject to reinvention, to reshaping. And the project of a progressive political economy is to reshape it. The counterpart to a democratization of the market is a deepening of democracy. This is then the second large axis of the programmatic alternative. A high-energy democracy. What is a high-energy democracy? A high-energy democracy is a democracy that is fertile in the production and the creation of structural alternatives, that doesn't need crisis to make change possible. It renders the impulse to transformation internal or endogenous to political life, and it therefore overthrows the rule of the living by the dead. A high-energy democracy depends on a series of institutional innovations, and we can classify these institutional innovations into four sets. The first set are the innovations that raise the temperature of politics. By the temperature of politics, I mean the level of organized popular engagement in political life. Because only a high participation politics can be a politics rich in structural content. The premise of conservative statecraft and conservative political science is that politics must be either institutional and cold, or it must be hot and anti-institutional. In other words, that at the end of the day, we must be required to choose between Madison and Mussolini. The opposing premise is that politics can be both hot and institutional. That political arrangements differ in the degree to which they elevate the temperature of politics. The arrangements governing the electoral regimes, like whether the vote is mandatory or optional, for example, the arrangements governing the use of money in politics, public financing of political activity, and the arrangements related to access to the means of mass communication, to the television, for example, for free for the political parties and social movements. These arrangements together determine the temperature of politics. Now, the second set of innovations has to do with the pace of politics. So take the American constitutional architecture. There is a liberal principle of the fragmentation of power, and there's a conservative principle of the slowing down of politics, the Madisonian scheme of checks and balances. The Americans believe mistakenly that these two principles are indissolubly and necessarily connected. But it's easily possible to reaffirm the liberal principle and to discard the conservative one. For example, if there's a deadlock between the political branches of government, we might allow either of the political branches to call anticipated elections, which, however, would always be for both branches to break the deadlock. And in this way, the branch that exercised the constitutional prerogative of breaking the deadlock would have to pay the political price of running the electoral risk. There are any number of mechanisms of that kind that could very easily transform the presidential regime into a machine for the acceleration rather than the slowing down of politics. Politics is slowed down not because it needs to be, but because the revered founders wanted to slow it down and wanted to inhibit the transformation of the social and economic order by the constitutional powers. The third set of institutional innovations has to do with the relation between strong central initiative and radical devolution, as in a federal system. So, as society goes down a certain track of recurrent structural change, it should be able to hedge its bets by allowing parts of itself to deviate from the predominant national solutions and to generate counter-models of the national future. So there will then be, in the country, in the republic, a dialectic of alternative models, predominant solutions and alternatives to them. The alternatives to them won't be abstractions, they won't be doctrines, they will be actual experiments. Now we know that this right of deviation or secession is dangerous, that can be used to entrench group or race or class privileges and persecute other groups. So of course its exercise would have to be vetted by both the political branches of government and by the judiciary to prevent its abuse. But it is of immense significance because it establishes the raw material, the Brownian motion, as it were, of a democratic experimentalism. And the fourth set of innovations has to do with the enrichment of representative democracy by elements of direct participatory democracy. It's not the fanciful idea that we can dispense with representative institutions altogether, but to which the left was repeatedly attracted in the past. It's the idea that we can, little by little, add to the representative institutions elements of direct or participatory democracy. And the result, the combined result of such innovations, the direction in which they go, is the direction of creating a basis in which we no longer need crisis in the double form of war and economic ruin to make change possible. The third axis of change is the self-organization of civil society outside the state and outside the market. A disorganized society cannot generate alternatives or act on them. The accumulation of social capital, the level of association, is not simply some natural phenomenon. We can shape it. For example, by the cooperative character of education, by the way in which we organize the provision of public services. So, for example, what do we have in the world by way of provision of public services? We have what you could call administrative Fordism, the provision of standardized low-quality services by the bureaucratic apparatus of the state. And the only alternative to that seems to be the privatization of public services in favor of profit-driven firms. But there is another option which will become increasingly significant in the course of the 21st century. And that is that the state supplies the universal floor, the broad minimum of public services. The state also operates at the ceiling in the development of the costliest and most complex public services. But in the broad middle area between the floor and the ceiling, the state engages civil society. It finances, it prepares, it monitors, it equips independent civil society operating through cooperatives, not for profit, to partner with the state in the experimental and pluralistic provision of public services as the best way to enhance their quality, while at the same time providing a trigger for the self-organization of civil society. And then we can add, as another way in which we could deliberately form social capital, the institution of a principle of social service. Every able-bodied adult in a contemporary democracy should have some responsibility to help take care of other people outside his own family. And we can imagine this as a responsibility exercised early in life or in part of the working year. Everyone exempt from military service, for example, when there is, as there should be, universal military conscription, becomes subject to mandatory social service. Now, the fourth axis has to do with education and the empowerment of the individual. So first let me state the core and an idea about education, and then generalize it into a more general conception. A knowledge economy for the many and a high-energy democracy both require an empowered and educated citizenry, but they require a very particular kind of education. Now, first let me state what is the practical background. In a country that is large, unequal, and federal in structure, like the United States, it is necessary to reconcile national standards of investment in quality with the local management of the schools by the towns and states. The principle must be that the quality of education that a young person receives cannot depend on the happenstance of where it is born. So, for example, the dependence of the school system on local finance is intolerable. And there should be a mechanism to intervene in a local failing school system that repeatedly falls beneath the minimum accepted quality, to fix it, to delegate its fixing to independent administrators to fix it and return it fixed. But what is the pedagogic model? You know, the Americans, they had an educational ideologist, John Dewey, but they accepted only part of his program. And they have now established in the country a radical educational dualism. There are two different school systems in the United States. There's an elite school system, which implements a truncated part of Dewey's program, and then there's a mass school system for the majority of the population, which is a disciplinary operation oriented to shallow encyclopedic knowledge. What is the method of education demanded by a high-energy democracy and a knowledge economy for the many? First, it must prioritize the acquisition of analytic and synthetic capabilities over the mastery of dead information, the encyclopedia. Now, these capabilities, these are not acquired in a vacuum of content. They require content. But with respect to content, it must prefer selective depth to encyclopedic superficiality, projects or themes. In its social setting, it must be cooperative. Cooperation among students, among teachers, among schools, rather than the juxtaposition of individualism and authoritarianism that now prevails. And above all, it must be dialectical. So every subject must be taught at least twice from contrasting points of view. Nothing can be taught just once. And this is the way in which, as I said in an earlier class, the young can be immunized early on against the orthodoxies of the university culture and delivered to the higher stages of education already safeguarded against the intellectual servility that awaits them in the universities. Now, this principle of this form of education that I've just described is really the heart of a more general idea. And the more general idea is that for there to be this vast experimentation in society, this, let's call it this storm of innovation and conflict, the individual must be secure in a haven of vital protected safeguards against public and private oppression and of capability assuring endowments, educational and economic endowments. That's the general idea. Historical social democracy has a narrative about the haven, but it has no narrative about the storm. This is its fundamental defect. The storm doesn't arise spontaneously. The storm has to be arranged. And this whole institutional program that I've just outlined could be described as the arrangement of the storm. Now at the end, I want to return to something that I said in the very first class. We all live in a counter-revolutionary interlude in this long revolutionary period in the history of humanity. So for the last 200 or 300 years, the world has been set on fire. There has been a revolutionary project. This revolutionary project has two sides, a political side and a personalist side. The political side has been carried by the doctrines of democracy, liberalism, and socialism. And the personalist side by romanticism, and especially today by the worldwide popular romantic culture. The political side promises the redemption of humanity from entrenched social division and hierarchy, from the class structure in particular. And the personalist side carries the message that every ordinary man and woman is divine and shares in the inner life of God, and therefore has this potential to ascend. This project remains today the most powerful project in the world. It has many enemies, but all of its enemies respond to it. So it continues to control the agenda. But it is now simultaneously strong and weak. It is strong because it does continue to control the agenda, but it is weak because its defenders no longer know what its next step should be. So the agenda of this course has been the discussion of this situation predominantly on its moral side. Today, I've just outlined a view of the political side, the next steps on the political side. And the idea that results that emerges is that on the moral side, there is an enduring, irresolvable duality in our moral consciousness. But on the political side, there's a large potential for overlap in a particular direction. And all of this would then be a way of not allowing our thoughts and deeds today to be shaped by the biases of the counter-revolutionary interlude in which we now live. The counter-revolutionary interlude in this long revolutionary period. But in embracing the message of defiance to the biases of the counter-revolutionary interlude, I am very much aware of Voltaire's warning that those who lack the spirit of their age will nevertheless have all of its defects.
Wonderful. Let us open this up for discussion. Please.
Professor Unger, could you speak more to the point about education and teaching contrasting viewpoints? Because it seems to me that there needs to be a balance between teaching contrasting viewpoints and still inspiring young people to admire where they come from and to also prevent too much sophistry or relativism in education. And so how do we find that balance?
So I think the school is in a very difficult situation.
Right.
We have this ambitious conception of the role of a school in a democracy, because there are two self-appointed masters of the school, the state and the family, right? The state says to the child, serve me, be useful to me. And the family says to the child, become like me. So the role of the school is to be the voice of the future and to engage in this struggle with the state and with the family to create this space in which the future has a voice. So the ideal of the school under a democracy is that the school recognize in every young person a tongue-tied prophet and create the space. Now, this is only feasible if the work that the school does can also seem to be useful to both the state and the family. Otherwise, it won't work. And that's this method that I described of this combination of attributes, which I think is useful. It is useful. It does prepare the person to live in a contemporary economy, in a knowledge economy, but also prepares him to experience this energized democracy. So this is the claim of its usefulness, but it has this potential. It's also about the future, the ability to look to the future. And I should say, it doesn't apply just to general education, but also to technical education. So the most influential model of technical education in the world is the old German model, which emphasized job-specific and machine-specific skills. This was the European conception. The elites have a general education, and the masses are trained to be workers, manual work and conceptual work. This distinction has lost its justification because the kind of technical education that is important today is education in higher level, flexible, conceptual and practical capabilities. The capabilities required for the use of numerically controlled machine tools. And that kind of technical education is on a continuum with this kind of general education that I've described. But the truth is that it's very difficult. I mean, just take the United States. I spoke about John Dewey. You know, John Dewey's program had two parts. One part was this stuff about analysis, cooperation, talk things through, and so forth. The other part was criticism. So the Americans rejected the criticism part. Huh? So what goes on in the elite schools is this: they sit around a table, they talk things through. What did they put in place of the other part? What they put in place of the other part was the acquisition of a particular type of sociability. So the individual should be insinuating, he should be charismatic, he should be able to cast a charismatic halo on his fellows, but at the same time to be self-effacing, to conceal the charismatic halo. This is a very delicate operation. The objective of the elite private schools in the United States, one of its prime objectives is to teach people this way of operating, this modus operandi. This is, I think, an abomination, right? But this is what they do. So we have, this is the reality, right? There's the good and the bad are mixed together in these historical realities. But we have to have the intellectual independence to see these realities for what they are. Well, I don't think that's what the bottom rung of public schools are like. No, they continue to teach to the test. There's an emphasis on the encyclopedia, on the mastery of information. There's all of that stuff. And it's basically a babysitting operation. It's a kind of discipline. In the Fordist factory of the economic paradigm of a previous period, the worker didn't need any education. So there was a lot of lip service given to education, but under the previous dispensation, the worker only needed three things by way of so-called education. One is elementary literacy and numeracy, to be able to interpret rudimentary commands. The second thing was a disposition to obey. Obedience is very important. And the third was rudimentary physical dexterity, especially in the form of hand-eye coordination. And this is what was really needed. And so long as the public schools provided people with those minimalist characteristics, that was enough. And that's a perfect explanation of why they did what they did. But they're teaching now to a world that no longer exists. That world doesn't exist anymore, the world in which those kinds of workers were needed. And so the country has a problem of transforming its educational system.
So you're going to primarily be elementary.
Basic education, yes.
Okay, so
Basic education.
yes, please.
So, given that trying to implement this policy program, if you implemented it, would provoke a strong backlash from those who continue to benefit from this system, but it also would lead to radical change, how would you go about doing it so that this policy
Yeah,
platform
well,
could
yes, but let me explain something, because which is very important to an understanding of this outline that I just stated. I know that all of this seems fanciful, revolutionary, and so forth in the discourse in which I've stated it. But let me go back and say again what I think I said in an earlier class. What's the situation now in the world? For anyone who attempts to argue programmatically, anywhere in the world, the situation is, I propose something that's far away from what exists. You say, well, that's very interesting, but it's utopian. I propose something that's close to what exists. You say that's feasible, but it's trivial. And so everything that can be proposed is likely to be dismissed as either utopian or trivial, right? Now, the first thing to say is that this false dilemma arises from a misunderstanding about the nature of transformative practice or programmatic arguments. They're not about blueprints. They're about sequences, about successions. And any succession worth thinking about can be described at points relatively close to what exists or relatively far away from what exists. It's the direction that matters. So the two most important attributes of a programmatic argument are first that it marks a direction, and second that in a particular historical circumstance, it selects the initial steps by which to begin to move in that direction. Now, this problem that I've just described is immensely aggravated by a contingent feature of the history of ideas, which has to do with the way we think about structure. So the old way of thinking about structure is exemplified by Marxist theory. And so it's that idea that structures are indivisible systems, and you either manage them or you replace them. And that way of thinking about structure has become literally incredible. No one believes in its social theoretical assumptions anymore, but they continue to use the vocabulary that depends on those assumptions. So there's immense confusion in the world. Now, the practical consequence of this intellectual situation is that we have no usable way of thinking and talking about structural change. I proceeded here in this argument as if we had a way, implying that we have a way and so forth. But we don't have a recognized way. And the consequence is that in the absence of a usable way of imagining structural change, we fall back on a bastardized conception of political realism, which is that something is realistic to the extent that it approaches what already exists. That's not the expression of a way of thinking about structural change. That's just a declaration of intellectual bankruptcy. We don't have a way of talking about structural change. So we say, if it's different from what exists, it's not realistic. If it's the same, and so forth. That's the background to this problem that you refer to. Now, in fact, any proposal for change can always be formulated in two equivalent vocabularies: as a series of institutional changes and as a series of coalitions or that involve reinterpretations of interests and of identities. So they're equivalent to each other. Every powerful transformative project has to build its own constituency. And that begins in the process of reinterpreting the way people currently understand their interests. Now, let me give you an example, which is an especially important example because it has to do with the core historical constituency of the left parties, which is the interests of the organized working class headquartered in the capital-intensive sectors of the economy, and especially in mass production industry. That was the core constituency of the left parties in the West. So this is an example of special importance. So now you can say today, what is the interest of these workers headquartered in what in the United States is called the Rust Belt industries? On one interpretation, their interest is to dig themselves into their present niche in the division of labor and defend it against all comers. So defensive measures, subsidies, constraints on plant closures, impediments to subcontracting and so forth. And what can you say? What you can say is that that has no future. I mean, all that can do is buy a few more years for mass production industry. It does not create an alternative. And so that is an example of an institutionally conservative and socially exclusive way of understanding the interests. I say socially exclusive because under that view, the interests of all the neighboring groups in social space, like the small business class, the temporary workers, the foreign workers, they're all the enemies. Now, but there's always another way of defining and defending the group interests, which is institutionally transformative and socially solidaristic. So it says, this has no future. If we are to have a future, we need to transform the Rust Belt industries into instances of the knowledge economy. There has to be an industrial conversion. And in that process of industrial conversion, the groups that we used to think of as our enemies have to become our allies. The small business class, the foreign workers, the precarious temporary workers, and so forth. So there's always this duality in the way of defining and defending class interests. Now, what I've just stated is the exact opposite of the Marxist view of agency. Because the Marxist view is that classes have an objective interest. And the more intense the class conflict, the more perspicuous, transparent the logic of class interest becomes. And if you make a mistake about what your real class interests are, the punishment is political defeat. That's the Marxist view. This view that I've just stated is the opposite of that, because it says the objectivity of class interest is an illusion based on stagnation. When conflict escalates, the question, what are my interests as a member of a certain class, becomes inseparable from the question, what are the accessible alternatives? And who would I become under these alternatives, and what would then be my interest in my identity? So that's the opposite view. So that's how I think about agency. So the discussion of ways of thinking about agency is intimately related to this problem of having an adequate view of structure, of structural change. And one always has to meet the class on its own terms, but then reinterpret. So another problem which is of great practical interest in the world today is this. The basic, if you define the small business class, also called the petty bourgeoisie in European theory, objectively, it's a minority of humanity. If you define it subjectively, it's the majority of humanity. So the industrial proletariat, the proletariat shrinks, the petty bourgeoisie expands. And the majority of people on the planet have a petty bourgeois horizon. So what do they aspire to? They aspire to a modest degree of independence and prosperity. By default, the instrument for the realization of this aspiration is traditional, archaic, isolated family business. A shop, a store, a little plot of land, in the absence of other things. That's the default expression of this petty bourgeois aspiration. One of the tasks of the progressives is to offer this majority in the world a series of other options by which they can realize their fundamental objective, their petty bourgeois aspiration, with which the left doesn't sympathize. But it has every reason to sympathize. It's simply an initial step on this ladder of ascent to a higher form of life.
What problems does your independent capital option solve? Particularly, I'm thinking about when you laid out the conflict, the irreconcilable conflict for the 19th century socialists of free work with the demands of
Economies of scale, yeah.
economies.
Yeah. Well,
Does it solve?
it's not. But let me be clear. It's not a solution for now. So remember, this is. I'm simply. That's why I call it a thought experiment. It's obviously nothing that anyone would propose today as an immediate solution. What I'm saying is it marks a direction. And the direction is the direction of demystifying the property right and the idea of the market. A market can have radically different forms. So what that problem solves is the idea that in order to have a market, we have to have this system of perpetual property rights, absolute property rights, and rights that can be then the object of hereditary transmission. So then we have, in order to have a market, we have capitalists. So through the capital auction, the problem that I solved was how to have, quote, capitalism with no capitalists. Because we expropriate the means of production. We say there's no permanent and perpetual property right. You use the productive resources of society if you can put them to good use. Whoever can put them to the best use should get to use them. So if a team of entrepreneurs and workers is using a pool of resources, and someone else says, I can do better, then the idea of the capital auction is that you transfer the resource, give them a chance. This is the basic idea. Now, obviously subject to a world of practical complications, but I'm describing what the principle is. Now, let me say something further, because I think that in a programmatic discussion like this, there will be a huge amount of confusion between the short term and the long term. Most of the proposals that I described at a level which I would call intermediate. They're neither very close to what exists nor very far away from what exists. The reason to do that in a conceptual exercise like this one is that the proposals discussed at an intermediate level characteristically serve the purposes of conceptual clarification. They help show what the direction is. But they have a great defect in practical politics. The defect is that the proposals at an intermediate distance are likely to seem too far away from the existent to be practical, but not far away enough to arouse enthusiasm. And that is the reason why in practical politics we avoid what I just did, these proposals at an intermediate level. And we combine the very practical with the prophetic. the very close to the very far away. That's the method of transformative discourse and politics. But what you have to understand is that it's all about the same thing, that it's about these sequences of transformation, which can be explored at points that are close to what exists or at points that are far away from what exists. And not jumble them all together as if there were one dimension of time. Huh? So there is, now, specifically on the property right, I would say the following. I just described, you asked the question, what is the problem that the capital auction solves? The problem is it deals with the inconvenience of having capitalists in order to have capitalism. And it describes a system in which there is capitalism, quote, the market order, but there are no capitalists. I would say we shouldn't render that absolute because the traditional unified property right has an advantage. The conservative economist Frank Knight said, the historical justification of capitalism is the existence of a class of people who are willing to pay a premium for the privilege of running a risk. So I would say we would want to have in any market order the unified traditional property right. It should be one of the options. And why? Because it allows an entrepreneur to do something that no one else believes in. He doesn't have to negotiate a consensus. He doesn't have to lift anyone's vetoes. He doesn't have to agree with a set of stakeholders. He can do something on his own, at his own risk. So that it's important for society to have that. But what I'm saying is the market order should not have a single dogmatic unitary form. We can imagine an experimental coexistence in the same market order of alternative regimes of private and social property. And then we can see what works and how it works and what the effects are. We don't have to pre-commit ourselves to one dogmatic formula. Yes?
So, your project, your project is the religion of the future, and talks about in one aspect how we ought to live, or I guess that's the name of the class. And then we also discuss a lot of politics. So I was wondering what the relation was between this religion of the future, or like the church and the state, or the church is your religion of the future, and how those morals are supposed to play into the structure.
I'm not sure I understand. So are you asking what's the relation between the political and the moral, or are you asking something else?
Yeah, because we call it the religion of the future, but we're talking a lot about politics, so it's like mixing the two.
Well, that's just a book. I mean, I'm not going to discuss it. I mean, I don't want to enter into the discussion of the categories of that particular book. What I would say, going back to a theme that I have returned to here in this course, is there's one of the fundamental differences between the moral perspective and the political perspective has to do with time. So our moral projects we pursue in biographical time and the span of a human life. Our political projects we pursue in historical time. And they're not on the span of a human life. Like this project that I just described, this is not for a human being in his own lifetime. This is a project that advances or retreats, succeeds or fails in historical time. And this is a fundamental difference because the individuals, of course, are impatient. And they want something that will work in the dimensions of their own life. I want to see it. I want to reach the promised land. I want to see it with my own eyes. And we're not allowed that. So our political projects are not for us in the sense of being projects that are realized or failed in historical time. And one of the main functions of our moral ideas is to serve as compensation for the failures of our political projects. Because I mentioned the statement of Augustine's, all ages are equidistant from eternity. Huh? Well, this is, but it matters to us whether we happen to be born at one time or another time. So I said, I regard myself as having been born in a counter-revolutionary interlude in a long revolutionary period in the history of humanity. And I am determined that my ideas and my actions will not be shaped by the biases of the counter-revolutionary interlude. I call it an interlude because I'm being hopeful. I'm hoping that the revolution will continue afterwards, and that's what we're discussing here. What we mainly discussed in the course has been what we do in the meantime, which is us. How are we going to live our lives? And that has been the object of this discussion. Now, the subtlety is that our moral ideas are connected to our political ideas. They have political implications. They make political presuppositions. And we've explored that in the treatment of these two contemporary ethics of self-fashioning and of connection. But they're different. And they present a different set of problems. Yes?
My question, apologies if I didn't formally correct it, but goes directly to that last point that you said. I'm really interested in this connection between the moral leading to a political kind of order.
Uh-huh.
If I kind of take a step back and I'm understanding this course correctly, and it seems to me that kind of the output of a new, whatever you want to call it, religion of the future or political system is a reshaping of human relations, right?
Yes.
Which is fundamentally different from this order that we saw thousands of years ago that's very hierarchical and you're more continued, right? So you made the statement at the beginning of the class that both the maximalist version of the ethic of connection and the corrective version of the ethics of self-fashioning create somewhat of an interesting and potentially compatible political position. And so what I kept thinking about is that I want to gain a better understanding of what kind of some of the implicit assumptions are in of these kind of two ethics combined that from your point of view are desirable. In other words, what type of connections, human connections or human relations are represented or valued
Yes.
in this kind of compatible project?
Yes.
It seems to be something of an element of compassion and individual liberty, but not at the expense of others per se in whole circumstances. So I just want to gain a better understanding of those things.
Well, but it's complicated. So, first of all, let me go back to that contrast which I proposed between the right and the left. And I said, one of the crucial points of the contrast was the goal. The goal is we become bigger together. And so we would have to elucidate philosophically what it means to become bigger. And it's this idea of freedom. Deep freedom, I called it. And it has to do with these contradictory conditions of self-assertion. That's one of the vocabularies in which we could explore and elaborate this conception. So, to be free, I have to connect with others, but every connection threatens me with subjugation. How can I connect without being subjugated? And love is not a solution, because love is only in the sphere of intimacy. We need an equivalent. And what do we think is the equivalent? The equivalent is some form of cooperation among free and equal individuals. But the institutional forms of that cooperation are always indeterminate and contestable. That's the subject, then, of political dispute. How do we organize the market? The market is a form of cooperation. How do we organize democratic politics? That's another form of cooperation, and so forth. Then there's a contradiction in the relation between the self and a particular world. So to be free, we have to engage in a real world. We can't be just onlookers. We can't be marginalized. But it seems that every real world is going to exact from us as the price for our engagement that we surrender to it. And if we surrender to it, we're not free. So to be free, we have to resolve that contradiction. We have to be able to engage without surrendering. We have to be able to deny the last word to the social world and to keep the last word for ourselves. We have to be, to use another vocabulary, insiders and outsiders at the same time. And that then leads to this notion that the institutions have to have this quality of not just being open to a wide range of contradictory experience, not neutral in the sense of liberal political theory, but open to a wide range of contradictory experience, and corrigible. We must be able to challenge them in the process of operating within them. Huh? And then we're free, we're bigger, we're greater. Huh? Then there's this third dimension, which has to do with our relation to ourselves. We have to form a coherent way of being in the world. The coherent way of being is a character, but the character can be rigidified and it can suck the life out of us. So we have to have this coherent way of being, and we have to be capable of disrupting it at the same time. And the price of this ability to disruption is that we make ourselves vulnerable to defeat, to disappointment, to derision. And so that's another definition of, so that's all by way of elaborating philosophically this idea of what's involved in our freedom. And what I'm saying is that conception of our becoming bigger is a conception that can be received and understood in both in the corrected version of the ethic of self-fashioning and in the maximalist version of the ethic of connection. So with the ethic of connection, remember we discussed the problem of subjugation, the problem of disunion, the problem of coldness. And the maximalist response to each of those problems involved more transformation of the social template and more acceptance of contradiction. And in the ethic of self-fashioning, remember, we criticized the emptiness of the ideal of autonomy. It has to have content. Its content comes from our engagements and connections in the light of our epiphanies and prophecies. And another defect, for example, with its Prometheanism, this triumphalist idea that the individual saves himself. So this conception that I've stated is a conception that has meaning, that is compatible, I would like to think, with both the maximalist form of the ethic of connection and the revised form of the ethic of self-fashioning. Now, all of that does not annul the difference between these ethics. So they remain distinct in their orientation. But it explains how it is possible for them nevertheless to converge in a wide set of their political implications. And that was the object of today's class. Yes?
I just had a question about the ethic of self-fashioning. One of your main critiques of it seems to be that it's without a politics or without a well-developed politics. And I was just curious.
Well, it actually has three kinds of politics, right? I mean, so there's the politics of the philosophers, which I characterize as implying this contrast between the elite disruptors and the conformists, the herd. Then it has a second politics, which is the politics of liberal political theory, which is tainted by this false and dangerous idea of neutrality and of the separation of the right and the good. And it has a third politics, which is the romantic politics, which depends on this invidious contrast of structure and anti-structure. This war against repetition and routine that Romanticism conducts, which is, I said, reflects a despair about the possibility of changing the relation of spirit to structure. So the claim was the uncorrected ethic of self-fashioning has a politics, but it's an unacceptable politics, coming in these three separate forms. So once we correct it, what politics does it in its corrected form suggest or sustain? And the argument is, here's a proposal of a politics which is compatible with this idea that we become bigger together.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Sure.
Let me go back to your intriguing vision of capitalism without capitalists. So I wanted to follow up.
You know, I'm opposed to the concept of capitalism because it's a confusion of Karl Marx's, this idea that there's this system. It would be better just to speak of a market order. Huh?
Sure.
And the market order can be reinvented.
Yeah. Well, let me make it more concrete, right? Because what I'm asking about is what to do with the means of production. And your idea was to somehow subject them to this arrangement. But then, how do we avoid the problem that always crops up when we try to nationalize them, right? That is this.
No, this is not. No, we're not. We're not making the state the owner. The state is not the owner. That is.
I understand that, but there will still be some managerial or bureaucratic class involved in.
There will be independent trusts or funds on my thought experiment, and so what happens? They are responsive to the political authorities, to the elected political authorities. So what we imagine is that there are these independent trusts. There isn't discretionary allocation of capital. They have different rules, different strategies, different portfolios of diversified investments or loans, if we want to call them that. And the democratic authorities observe their actions and say, this is working, that's not working, we want to allow more of that, less of that. So there is some collective judgment through the democratic institutions of this. But the implementation is autonomous and not under discretionary governmental allocation. And that's why I would say it would not be correct to call it the state. I think one problem that exists in the definition of a market is if I'm having a debate with an economist and I propose change the market this way, change the market that way, the first impulse of the economist is always to interpret my proposal as a form of statism. The reason is that the economist identifies his idea of the market, that is the market that exists, with the market. But the market is a creation of the law. No market exists naturally. And this is a debate about which market. So, and it's important to say this because it may not be obvious. So for 200 years, the model of ideological conflict has been a hydraulic model. More state, less market, more market, less state, synthesis between state and market. That's social democracy or social liberalism. Now, this whole argument presupposes a different idea of what the ideological conflict is about. It says it's about the alternative institutional forms of the market, of democratic politics, and of independent civil society. The alternative institutional forms of economic, political, and social pluralism. The forms that are established in the rich North Atlantic world are a subset of a much larger universe of institutional possibilities. And to achieve our interests and ideals, the claim is, we have to travel in the other subsets. We have to expand the debate. That's the view of ideological conflict. And it rejects the idea that the subject is the state or the state against the market. the subject here in the economic part of the discussion is which market, given that the market has no natural form. And this is actually, you know, this is a very strange feature of the history of ideas too, because the single greatest analytic achievement of legal theory in the 150 years from the middle of the 19th century to the end of the 20th was the deconstruction of the idea that the market has a single natural and necessary form. And this deconstruction was achieved by people who intended to demonstrate the opposite. That is, the jurists set out to demonstrate that the categories of private property and freedom of contract could serve as the basis of a whole system, that you could deduce from them all the arrangements of the market. And then they discovered the opposite, that as you go down the ladder of concreteness, at each point down the ladder, there are choices to be made. And the choices turn on conflicts of interest and of vision, and the answers can't be inferred from the abstractions at the top of the list. You cannot infer the answers to those questions by going back. So that, for example, was what Oliver Wendell Holmes did. This was the content of American jurisprudence. Now, to this day, that central insight of legal theory has never fully penetrated the inner sanctum of practical economics. So the economists don't understand that. They think a market is a market, property is property, and contract is contract. The lawyers know that all of those propositions are false. This is an extraordinary disharmony which is basically, I think you have to say, it's basically ignorance. It's not just ideology. You know, I used to think that the main problem with economics was ideology. Now I think that it's ignorance. I think we're over, Michael.
And that's a perfect moment to bring today's discussion to a close. So thank you so much. We very much look forward to seeing you next week.
So I'm saying, in this conception of the conditions of self-assertion, there are three conditions of freedom, and not particular vocabulary. One is we need to connect with that conception. The second is we need to be able to engage in